So I'm here to talk to you about the changing landscape of journal tenders, and to preface that a little bit. I didn't realize I was going to build. There we go. I just wanted to just make a mention of some of the areas that I've worked in over the years and some of our current brands. So I've been working in the journals publishing primarily sector for an awful long time now, over 30 years, as a subscription agent, as a technology provider, as a consultant, a number of other roles. I'm currently associated with 4 organizations. Renew Consulting for Societies, on whose behalf I'm talking to you today. And Renew Consulting for Societies helps societies to get the best working relationships with their publishing partners and going through that process. So it's with that particular hat on I'll be talking today. Renew Publishing Consultants also work with publishers and also obviously society publishers on their publishing strategy. I'm also a board member of AccuComms, another business that's featured downstairs in the exhibit area, which is an organization that does global journals and book sales and marketing as a marketing agency. And also recently, Cadmore Media. I'm a co-founder of startup service provider in media technologies for societies and publishers, because one of those diversifications that Sam was just referring to, I think, as we're seeing, is more and more work in audio and video content. So with so many hats to juggle, I'll concentrate back now on that first one. First of all, just a note of where our work comes from. We do have the benefit of seeing the world, nice even distribution of our work really across the world. 21% of our work comes from UK, and the majority of that from societies and university presses. North America is 52% of our work. The rest of Europe is 19%, and the rest of the world 8%. So we do get to see a very nice global picture of what's going on. Here we go. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the evolution of journal subscriptions in particular and what happened over the years. Going back a long way to when I started in the business, traditionally they were, of course, one-to-one sales, a publisher selling a subscription to a library. Then the characteristics of that sale was that there would be a very strong subject fit, of course, and the attrition rates, the cancellation rates would be, of course, very low as well. But the good journal would only really be expecting to get a few hundred libraries worldwide to buy it at full price, print being shipped around, and so on. So, but still very good match generally to where the researchers were working in a field. Now, with the advent of electronic journals, a whole new line of sales became possible. And we started to do package sales. I suppose there were package sales in print a long time ago as well, but more recently package sales. And they were still probably subject focused, and so you benefit from all of those things above. But there was a way of leveraging more content into a single deal. Now, you'll be aware that the very largest publishers, commercial publishers normally, but also some of the larger not-for-profit publishers, also do big deal sales, which is basically finding a deal that works for the library, whereby the entire content of the big publisher is sold to a library or a consortium of libraries. These so-called very big deals. And that is now the dominant model really for large publishers and large libraries in doing business. But everything is sold a little bit of a discount. So what about big deals and why are they there? Well, basically, because libraries like them. So although there's a lot of pushback, and we'll come back to that in a minute, fundamentally libraries like big deals. They have to do a lot less purchasing administration to get much bigger collections. And it's not long ago that I would used to talk to libraries and they'd say, well, even significant university libraries in London who might say, we subscribe to 6,000 titles or 7,000 titles, journals. And you talk to them now in the same places, say, we now subscribe to 60,000 titles because they're part of packages. It may not be that they're all desirable or what they wanted, but it's just easier to get very, very large collections through big deals. They're also, of course, quite good for publishers. Again, there's less admin in dealing it, much better lock-in. It's much harder to retreat from a big deal. And also, it's actually effectively easier to launch a new title. Not necessarily easier to monetize it, but it's easy to get it an audience, which is obviously a very big step on the way to getting a new title, because you can get them a readership quite quickly. And of course, generally speaking, you get more readership by having bigger deals. And bigger deals and more readership ultimately leads to more citations to journals, so it enhances the success. So they are good for journals too: better global reach, more readership, more citations. The interesting part, though, comes because the high-impact titles, which are generally, usually larger and often also more expensive, are going to be the cornerstone of those big deals. Now, this is an illustration of what that might look like, and I'm just going to talk you through this chart here. So it's basically a cumulative price of a big deal from the point of view of how many titles along here, along the bottom there, that are added into the deal, and how much money, incremental amount of money each one generates as it's added. Now, not that big deals are ever divided up, but effectively, because the very biggest titles are also generally the most expensive and the highest impact, they're, and also generally, therefore, discounted less. They get most of the revenue, or generate most of the revenue from the bigger deal, but there's a very long tail of smaller, lower, lesser titles, which will, of course, attract much less income, and that's up in this territory here. So the high impact, the cornerstone titles, if you like, of a deal are in this part, generating the money, and the lower impact ones are over there somewhere. So that basically means it's quite hard to monetize this part of the curve for anyone, really. So what that may mean is a tendency over time, especially if libraries are pushing back a little bit on the big deals, it devalues these titles even further. It's harder and harder to make money out of them. So we are seeing, to some extent, the culling of smaller, less successful titles, or the selling off or the releasing of titles from some of these collections. The less successful ones, the ones that won't attract enough money. But the reverse of that is that, of course, it means the higher impact titles are worth even more. They're even more prized. So that wasn't negative at all. I've got a positive piece of news in there after all. And so that's had an interesting effect as we deal with journal tenders and see societies putting their journals out for retender. We're seeing quite a strong defensive strategy for really desirable titles, and the incumbent publisher putting in better and better offers to stop the society, or to dissuade the society from going out to tender in the first place. So that's obviously very good news if you're in a position of having good stuff. So what's happening to the big deals? There's definitely a downward pressure on price in the market. That sometimes manifests itself as a breaking up of packages. And although these are headline grabbing, they're still rather rare. Most of the big publishers, depending on how you count numbers of libraries and number of deals, will have between 3 and 5, maybe 6,000 libraries buying into big deals. And yet we hear they're headline grabbing when we hear 2 or 3 or 4 who are pushing back and cancelling, or even 10, and that kind of scale. So the big deals are still there. Definitely news of their demise is somewhat exaggerated. There are major disputes at a country level, like Germany, Holland, recently Scandinavia, but generally, these get resolved in the end, especially where publishers are being more flexible. I deliberately left this typo in when I saw it earlier. I discussed it in advance and thought it would be funny. But so there are also offsetting deals where you get a deal with a consortium which is part subscription, big deal, and part open access author fee, so that it allows countries that want to drive the open access agenda to provide a local incentive or an easier way for their researchers to go open access and yet maintain access to the existing content. I simply haven't got the time to go into the whys and wherefores of those things, but moving on a little bit and looking at open access journals, the world is producing more and more articles, there's no doubt. It is hard to monetize new subscription journals because of whether you put them in a big deal or whether you try and sell them individually. It's tough to either gain a fraction of a big deal or indeed to just get some enough library attention to buy it. So that's very hard. It's much easier to get money for a gold open access journal. So we've seen the mega journals, PLOS One and Nature Science Reports since then. There are, of course, thousands of so-called hybrid titles where it's primarily a subscription title, but authors can pay to have content individually made free, article by article. And of course, there are many normal-sized, wholly open access journals as well, some of which have been extremely successful. So it's generally seen as an easier way of getting open access, getting a journal off the ground is to launch an open access title. Now, I'll put this very, very simple chart up, or simplistic, I should say, about business model change. And there's a very, very simple and obvious test that you could perform if you were thinking of switching any title from its subscription status into an open access status, is you could simply look at the gross subscription income that title generates and divide it by how much open access revenue it would generate if you could persuade every author to pay for gold open access as part of that journal. And if you obviously divide one by the other, if you've got a figure of less than 1, it's theoretically going to be relatively easy to move to open access. And if you've got a figure of greater than 1, moving to open access will cost you money. The problem with this chart is, of course, the very biggest publishers have also been the most successful at pushing journal content, selling journal content to libraries, whether it's their own journals or journals on behalf of societies. So, of course, if they're on that top line there, their subscription revenue may well be many multiples of the theoretical open access revenue, and it becomes very unattractive to do it. A similar high-impact title, but in perhaps a smaller commercial publisher with less reach into the market, well, is closer to the mark. And similarly, probably, headline titles within societies are also difficult to switch. But as you go down to medium and lower impact titles, then they become more tempting to switch, especially lower and medium ones within a society environment. So it's not just down to the price of the journal, of course, it's down to the subscription volume. Because high impact titles tend to have more subscriptions. And ironically, of course, the more successful you've been at selling subscriptions, the harder it is to flip to an open access model. If you've done really badly in the past, now is your cue to do really well in the future. So where are we going with all this? Well, I think the world is changing. Journals are becoming devalued slowly, and I mean that in their literal economic sense rather than in their content sense. There is pushback on pricing, governments making less money available, and so on. The world market is reasonably mature now with a few growth pockets and so on. I do think I used to think that the long tail of journals would be acquired, but now I rather fear this long tail of journals will simply be cut off and discarded because there's a land grab for content in open access. And so what we're seeing is, because open access is simply a service business, and you get to maintain your margins, your absolute margins as a publisher through volume, because you can't maintain your percentage margins you used to get from having a product, i.e. subscription. So naturally, the thing to do is try to publish more and more and more. And so it's very going to be quite likely that the content from the long tail of publishing is simply swept away into more successful titles as we go on. These are long-term trends. One of the things that's apparent in this market is just how steady everything is. Okay. The other thing we're seeing as well is diversification in the market as societies change what they're doing a little bit to meet, diversify teaching products, professional development products, and so on. So finally, what do you have to do to get the best deal? Well, I always say, what do you mean by best for a start? There's obviously things like money, reputation, scope, longer term aims. Where are you aiming with your journals? There's still very much a strong market for the best titles, less so for the weaker ones. But often it still comes down to the individual who's associated with the journal. There's a strong theme about individuals developing today. The editor-in-chief is often a key driver. And there's leveraging the community. What can societies do with authors and the globalization of authorship? All of those things help play into getting the best deals for your titles going forward. And I better stop, especially because I finished. But thank you very much, and I'll hand over.
Thank you.